Hello, everybody. It's lovely to have you with us today on screen. We're delighted to welcome you to this Generations for Climate Change. I'm Anne Burgess and I'm a member of the COTA South Australian Board, and I chair the Policy Council and its Climate Change Group. And today, together with the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, we are hosting this really exciting initiative. Today we're going to hear from some brilliant speakers, John Hewson, Sam James and Hollee McKinnon. I want to say first up, they're not climate scientists, but they're really passionate and interested in climate change, and they've got some great views that we're going to canvass today. We're also going to canvass some of your ideas and questions, and hopefully all of us are going to leave more enlightened and fired up about climate change. So we want to start by acknowledging the land we're hosting this webinar from today is the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship to their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Adelaide region, where I am today, and their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. So we recognise that some of you are joining us from various locations, and we pay our respects to traditional owners of the land you join us from today. I'm sure you're all familiar by now with the way that webinars work. We've spent hours on screens these days. But just to remind you, you'll only be able to see and hear our speakers and me. But later on, there'll be a Q&A, and we encourage you to pose questions to our panellists. If you just hover your mouse at the bottom of the screen at any time and hit the Q&A button to type in your question, and we'll try and get to as many of those questions as we can. And just to let you know, we're recording this session, so people who can't join us at this time we can share this with at some other time. But first, we wanted to get a snapshot of who you are with us today and some of your ideas. So we're going to use some polls. So you'll see a poll on your screen now. It says who is our audience and some age groups. And please, can you fill that in right now? And so we'll see who's with us today. Don't be shy about it. Come on. Tell us your age. We can't see your faces. Just use your mouse and click on. So we've got some older people like me, and we've got some younger people like Hollee and Sam. John, I'm not putting you in any category. So thank you very much for that. I hope you could see all those results. And now we're going to ask you about many countries have adopted a target to reach zero net emissions by 2050 or earlier, as you know. Australia doesn't currently have a target, which I'm sure our speakers will refer to. So when do you think Australia should aim to get to zero net emissions? So let's see your response to that. More than 2050 or less than 2030? 10 years or a lot more? So let's see what you've said about that. So lots of people wanting urgent action. That's good to see. So thank you very much for that. And a final question. There are many people are concerned about many things in terms of climate change, but what are you most concerned about? So if you had to put your money on one thing, where would you put it? It's hard, I know. You can't tick more than one. Have a go. So let's see what people are saying about that. So impacts for the future generations just gets ahead of current government action, but there are scores on all of those things. So again, I think our speakers will probably pick up those issues. So thank you very much for that. It's lovely to hear from you who are watching and listening to us today. So just a bit about why COTA. So why is COTA, we are Council on the Ageing, is a people's movement for older Australians. Why are we interested in climate change? Well, because we did a big survey and our polling showed us that older people have consistently listed very high in their concerns, just below health, which often comes up top in older people's concerns. And then there's cost of living. So just behind health and cost of living came climate change. And our survey in South Australia showed us that 90% of those surveyed about climate change were concerned or very concerned. And as you saw in the poll just a bit earlier, they're concerned about leaving a world for future generations, their grandchildren, that is healthy and sustainable. And they're concerned about bushfires and droughts. If you think of this last 12 months in South Australia, we've had drought and then bushfires and then COVID. And older people are saying they're really concerned about those things and they want to know what they can do to help. So we had a really strong response to our poll and people were really concerned about what they could do. So you can see on screen now that people are saying, you know, we've tried to do what we can, we recycle, we talk to our friends, we raise these issues with people, and those are things that we feel that we're doing. We want to do more, we want to see what we can do. So at COTA, as a people's movement, we want to do more than just reflect those concerns. We want a platform for action. And so we thought, who better to partner with than Australian Youth for Climate Change, AYCC. So we want to work across the ages, across the generations, and work together to achieve change. So we believe at COTA that climate is an intergenerational issue, which mobilises the feelings of older people and younger people. And this first webinar provides an opportunity for those voices to be heard. So we have three thoughtful and passionate speakers to address us today. Firstly, let me introduce Dr. John Hewson. Many of you know about John's extensive political, academic and community activities, but it might surprise you, unless you read some of his articles, it might surprise you to know that he's passionate about climate change. So over to you, John, to talk to us about why climate change matters to you.
Well, thank you very much, Anne. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me begin by paying my respects to the first Australians on whose land I'm meeting, which is the Gundungara people. I am speaking to you from Bowral, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. But I would also issue a challenge to government. After about 250 years, it's soon enough, I think, for us to exactly give proper recognition to the first Australians, give them a voice in the Parliament and obviously a recognition in our Constitution. But more importantly, I think, to actually genuinely address the issue of disadvantage. And I think that should be a priority for whoever's in government. On climate, look, let me begin by looking at the essence of this grouping, young and old. I looked at the voting statistics last night, and there are 31% of people who vote who are aged over 60, and there are 30% of people who are aged under 30. So you have the most powerful political lobby you could ever imagine, with 60% of voters. Indeed, if you look at just older Australians, 48% of Australian voters are aged over 50. And I'm surprised that the strength of those sort of individual groups or together as a coalition has not been recognised in our political system. You can change governments in a heartbeat if you actually organise and mount that sort of campaign. Look, on climate time, yes, I sit here today as totally frustrated. I mean, I've been interested and active in this issue since the late 80s. Took a policy to the early 90s election calling for a 20% cut in emissions by the year 2000 off a 1990 base. And if I think about if we'd just done that each decade since then, we'd be sitting today at about half the level of emissions of our Paris commitments. And we have lost hundreds of thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in investment and growth simply because we haven't seen the significance of that. I thought climate was an emergency in the early 90s. It's a particular emergency today. And the reality of the numbers is pretty tough. I mean, we need to halve emissions by 2030 and then halve them again by 2040 if we are to achieve a net zero emissions target by 2050. And that is a major global challenge. Obviously, the world has been fairly spasmodic in its response to climate, and there's been a lot of politics in it. I'm taking some heart today, though, that a Biden victory may change the global dynamics on climate. And I get frustrated when I see the work that Greta Thunberg and others have done to raise the profile of the issue. And then I look and say, well, what impact did that have on governments? And the answer is very little. But I think if Biden actually does embrace net zero and he does embrace some of the other targets that he's set, and if he does actually have a green action plan and implement it, then the world will change. And, we've already got Boris Johnson committed to making the next COP due at the end of next year to be a major defining event from the point of view of a response to climate. And he wants to lead that. And I'm sure Biden won't want him to lead that. He'll compete with him, and then the Europeans will compete. And I think the Chinese, who've committed to net zero by 2050, will compete, and the South Koreans and so on. The thing that disturbs me most in all of that is that we are already a laggard, and our Prime Minister is already saying we're not going to be swayed by a Biden victory. We're not going to change our position. We're going to achieve net zero. We're going to achieve our Paris commitments, 26 to 28% reduction in emissions by 2030 in a canter. The only way he can do that is cheat, because our emissions are not going down. I mean, he wants to use carryover credits from the Kyoto period. That's not emissions reductions. And so we're way behind, way off the ball. And we've got a long way to go to actually do what we should do, not just because of our emissions per capita are one of the lowest in the world, 1.3%, I think, of global emissions, but we are a major exporter of fossil fuels. And if you recognise that, we are number 5 or 6 emitter in the world. We have a significant responsibility, not only here in Australia, but internationally, to address this issue. And so, there's a lot of work to be done to change the mood in this country, to change the circumstances. I think Biden will put a lot of pressure on the global debate, and I think you'll get a very significant acceleration. But, 26, 28% reduction by 2030, that is half what the Climate Change Authority recommended we should be doing. So we've been ducking and weaving and playing politics with this issue for decades. As householders and businesses, we're now paying a lot more for electricity and gas than would otherwise have been the case. And as I say, we've lost all those jobs and investment in the process. So in these circumstances, it's a real opportunity for Australia to actually pivot and to try and catch up with the rest of the world. We were a world leader in the Kyoto process, and we're now a world laggard. And I think that is a tragedy that should be a national embarrassment to everyone concerned. And I'm pleased that movements like COTA and Australian Youth Coalition and so on are trying to push this debate, to try and push for leadership. And, there's always been this mythology in Australia, created perhaps by John Howard, that if you do anything on climate, it's going to cost you jobs, it's going to cost you growth. That is nonsense. You are foregoing the opportunity of creating a whole lot of new industries and new jobs and have a fair transition. So the challenge today is to set pathways through to whether it's 20, 40, 30, 20, 30, 40 or 50. as to how we can reduce emissions according to some sensible targets. All our states have adopted, by the way, net zero targets. A lot of our cities have, a lot of businesses have, you know, even the big miners have. They're moving away from thermal coal and so on. The government is just not listening. But the challenge is to set pathways. What do we need to do to get to 100% renewables as fast as we can? What do we need to do to electrify the vehicle fleet or move to hydrogen power in the transport sector? How fast can we go with regenerative agriculture to put the carbon back in the soil? That can be better than net zero in the agriculture sector. What should we do about building codes? What should we do about industrial processes and standards? These are the sectoral challenges that exist. And I think there's good government in just identifying those pathways, managing those pathways, making sure the transition is cost effective, if you like, but also fair. And to get that balance right over the next couple of decades, we need to be a very low carbon, if not negative carbon society by the mid-century. And we need to be moving at a pace in order to achieve that. And so that's the challenge as I see it. And the opportunity is very real. And so many of these issues are there to be dealt with. We have waste everywhere. We can turn waste into biofuels. We can turn waste into electricity. We can, you know, have refinery industries and recycling businesses right across Australia because the waste is spread right across Australia. It's a regional strategy as well. We don't have fuel security. If the ships don't come out with our fuel from Singapore, we don't have fuel. We should be making ethanol. We should be making biodiesel, biofuels generally. This is a challenge that's there, but it's an opportunity. And, you know, people are looking for a recovery from COVID. The essence of that recovery can be a very green action plan through for the next several decades. So far, we haven't seen anything of an action plan in terms of recovery from COVID. We're living day by day, trying to learn by doing and losing opportunities at every turn. Now, COVID was a major challenge. It told us a lot of things. To me, it was a dress rehearsal for what will happen if we don't listen to the science, we don't pay attention to the advice and the warnings of the climate scientists and others as to what will happen if we don't address the climate issue as a matter of urgency. Yet on the positive side, I mean, we've got to take great hope from the way as a community we've been able to respond to COVID. And we've changed the way we live, we've changed our lifestyle, we've changed the way we work, the way we travel, the way we entertain, what we eat. You know, and these have been dramatic changes, and it gives you great encouragement that if there's a collective objective within which each person, group, business, civil society, organisation, whatever, can see their role, can see their responsibility, and we all move together doing our own bit as well as working collaboratively in terms of a national or international objective. You've got to take great heart from that. You've got to say, look, COVID has been a dress rehearsal for the way it can be, if we really want to address it. And I realise today in South Australia, everyone's now worried about another wave, and we've seen how quickly that can take hold. We can't be complacent. But as a community, we accept that reality and we are adjusting to that reality. We should be doing that with climate. Climate is a much bigger challenge than COVID, much bigger. And we shouldn't be underestimating the fact that challenge is there and the opportunity that it brings us to change our behaviour in a way that's consistent with a low carbon world. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So what I've heard you say is that you've been fighting this war for like 30 years or something, that we're already way behind, and you know, to play catch up, it requires a lot of strong action right now and over the next 10 years particularly. I think you're saying as well that there are political opportunities for us, you know, worldwide, and particularly with the changes in the US. And what I heard you say, which I think is really helpful, is that there need to be set pathways so that people can see that there are pathways out of certain industries, and then there are, you know, pathways into jobs and growth through new industries. So who should be setting those pathways, do you think?
Well, the government can provide that framework, and it should provide that framework. I mean, I see the debate in recent days from the coal industry, workers in the coal industry. There are a lot of people in the coal industry who accept the reality that we will not be able to rely on thermal coal into the future. It will increasingly will play a lesser role in electricity generation, for example, or the petroleum industry as a source of fuel. So what you need to do is plan that. You know, it's a dirty word in Australia, planning, thinking beyond today, not worrying about scoring a point on the opposition today, but thinking about longer term strategic challenges. And that's the thinking that's got to be done. And I think if government works with business, with civil society and so on, to agree a framework within which those pathways can be identified, and they're pretty obvious in most sectors. I mean, in the power sector, we've started the transition to renewables. Why not finish it? Why not accelerate the closure of coal-fired power stations? Don't imagine you should be building new ones. Don't imagine that you should go to a gas generator as an alternative to a coal-fired generator when you don't need to, because solar power, for example, is so much cheaper. And, you know, the banks won't finance these projects anymore. The insurance companies won't invest. And the only way a gas generator would be built or a new coal-fired power station would be built is if the government pays for it. And the taxpayers really should not be prepared to stand for that. And you know, in electric vehicle, in the vehicle fleet, is electrification of vehicles has started. And everyone says, "Oh, it's going to take too long." Just remember, you know, it only took 10 years in the United States, from 1903 to 1913, to move from horse-drawn vehicles to broad-based petrol-driven vehicles. Just 10 years, at a time where we didn't have the adaptive capacity we have today. We didn't have the technology we have today. Didn't have the marketing, capacity we have today. So, you know, we can make these transitions very quickly. And once there's a relatively cheap electric car, I can imagine everyone's going to want one. You know, and that'll happen faster than people imagine. And so we should create the framework in which people will be encouraged to say, well, let's do that. Let's move. People are moving, they're moving slowly. Suddenly these things gain momentum. Look at the uptake of some of the technology, these mobile phones, my gosh. You know, the pace at which the world has adopted that technology and the improvements in that technology as you get next generation improvements one after the other. And that's the opportunity. In regenerative agriculture, we you know, there's a great concern in the community about drought, for example.
Yeah.
And why aren't we doing something to make our soils more drought resistant, more resilient? And the answer is, if you increase the carbon content of the soil, simple changes in farming techniques, don't use chemical fertilizers, use organic fertilizers, manage your land better, manage land clearing better, rotate your crops with your animals and so on. You can dramatically increase the carbon content of the soil, such that agriculture as a whole is a net negative emitter. You know, they can carry the load for a lot of other sectors, while it takes a longer time, for example, to adjust industrial processes, steel and concrete and so on. You're buying a lot of time in agriculture. And you're solving the drought problem. You're making yourself more resistant. We know with climate change, you're going to have more droughts. They're going to occur with greater frequency, greater intensity. Same with bushfires, and perhaps even the same with pandemics. In those circumstances, why aren't we listening to the science?
Okay, thanks, John. That's fantastic. Lots of points there and positive way forward. Just a reminder to everybody, you've got a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Hit that and send us your questions. So next we're going to hear from two members of the Youth Climate Change Coalition, Sam James and Hollee McKinnon. And they're going to give us their perspective from a younger person's point of view. And Holly's going to go first. Thank you, Hollee.
All right, so climate change started to matter to me because when I was younger, about 14 or 15, I got really ill really suddenly. And I was in hospital for about a month. And when I got out, they sort of told me that they didn't really know what's wrong, but this was going to be my new normal. And my mum and I were just not really willing to accept that. So we consulted a bunch of different people, and eventually someone finally suggested going vegan. And because going vegan is so different to a regular dietary framework, we had to do a lot of research. And I sort of found out that, yeah, I just really couldn't believe what I was eating had such an impact on the world. And this just opened up like a massive can of worms for me. And I started looking into like waste, energy production, emissions, all of it. And I was just like, this is like, yeah, insane. And when I voiced these concerns to the people around me, everyone just sort of thought of it as a future problem instead of something that was happening right now in front of us. And I felt like I was just shouting into this void, basically. It was a really conflicting time for me because I was so sure in this decision to become vegan, but it opened me up to this like impending doom. I was like, why wasn't anyone actually doing anything about this? And this played on my mind for maybe 7 years, I think. And unfortunately, I didn't act on it as soon as I could have because I didn't think that I could make any difference on my own. So last year, I started a degree in environmental policy and management. And what I learned from this was that I really had to start making action right now. I searched for something to get into, but I felt like I had to wait until I was qualified to do so. So then one day I was really happy. I stumbled upon the AYCC and I went to one of their induction meetings and I just felt this weight lift right off my shoulders. It was just so incredibly empowering to find a group of young people that actually cared just as much as I did. And to be honest, I actually cried tears of joy after my first meeting with them. I felt like I just found my home. It was great. So I joined right when they started working on the Origin campaign, which was stopping them fracking for gas in the Northern Territory. The project was set to cause significant damage to Indigenous lands and was being done really without their consent. In one of my first meetings I attended, someone said, the people who contribute to this problem the most are those who, the people who contribute to this problem the least are those who are being impacted the most. And it was like something in my brain just clicked and I realized that I was doing this all for the right reasons because I knew that I didn't want to live in a world where that was actually the case. And I had no other option but to use the privilege that I've been given to work alongside those communities to make sure that their voice is heard. And I've discovered through working with the AYCC that this is really what's at the core of climate justice, that we really need to fight for community-led solutions and fight for sovereignty alongside First Nations people. I guess ultimately, I just think it's important to debunk the idea that climate activism is some really big, scary, difficult thing. If you've got passion, a little bit of time on the side, you can actually make such a big difference because at the end of the day, like we're all just regular people doing our best to fight for something that we believe in, that we're passionate about. And I think while we have the power to do so much on our own, the road to the better future only exists if we actually work on this together. So I think it's really integral to be part of the conversations like the one we're literally having right now, because climate change is going to impact us all. And yeah, I think the AYCC overall really do put a big emphasis on the power of conversations. And through working with them, I've learned the skills on how to effectively discuss climate change and the skills, and the injustices associated with it. And because of this, the conversations I'm having are feeling less like shouting into this empty void and a little bit more collaborative, mostly in the sense that people are now, I'm seeing, either willing to listen or are sharing that exact same frustration. So yeah, through these conversations, I've noticed a massive transformation in the way that people are like thinking about climate change, talking about climate change, and it's actually started to give me hope when I used to have none. So it's been great. And I mean, yeah, after all, we're literally here today having this conversation intergenerationally on this massive issue. It's just absolutely incredible. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And I'll pass over to Sam.
Thanks, Holly. Welcome, Sam.
Hi, thanks, Holly. I thought I'd start by talking about how I got involved, how my life until this point has shaped me into a person who cares about climate justice and is passionate about having these exact kinds of conversations. So I was born in the Riverland on the stolen land of the Ngarrindjeri people. My parents owned a property which they were dedicating to rehabilitating with native horticulture. My earliest memories are out in the red dust of my mum as she harvested, propagated and planted native seeds and seedlings. And then grew up in Kapunda on the stolen land of the Ngarrindjeri people a bit further north from the city than Adelaide, on a goat farm which my mum dedicated to ecological sustainability. Our family never shied away from conversations about climate change, of which my mum was an early believer in John Hewson's era of climate action. sustainability and our impact on the world. I can't remember a time in my life that I didn't wholeheartedly believe that if we all work together, we could change the direction we're heading in. However, I was also facing the reality of living in a small rural farming town. We're in the safe state Liberal seat of Sturt, and the fact that I brought my recess to school in recycled butter containers to reduce our single-use plastic was laughed at by my peers. These issues either didn't exist or they did and they didn't matter because we couldn't do anything about them. I was isolated from any real action I could take, surrounded by people outside of my immediate family who were climate deniers. This was despite watching in real time climate change slowly take hold of the region. My year 12 formal was cancelled because of the Pinery bushfires, which were the biggest, fastest and most unprecedented bushfires our region had seen until last summer. In the winter following, we had the 2016 blackout caused by a storm, and I was trapped in the city because the area surrounding our house was flooded and I couldn't get back in. Crop seasons are slowly moving out of their routine and yields are unpredictable. I knew it was climate change, but what could I do about it? I was at a party living my best life and ranting about climate change when I was introduced to AYCC. I didn't know that Adelaide, of all places, would have a group of young people who all cared about climate change and were actually doing something about it and owning the fact that they were young. In this youth movement, there is room for young people to exercise our voices, skills, and imaginations to design the tactics we want to use to create the world we want to see. I finally made it to a welcome night and I was introduced to the issues of the Adani Carmichael coal mine. The state leader at the time was Maddie Saar, and she spoke so passionately about what AYCC had already accomplished in stopping the project and what more could still be done. My life really hasn't been the same since that night. I sort of jumped in head and shoulders. I've since been involved in the Adani and Origin campaigns, as well as working with our branch to design a niche in the Fight for the Bike campaign so we could fight for an issue in our backyard. And now we're working to stop any new public money being committed to new gas developments as we recover from COVID. We have a critical role to play as South Australians, as two critical federal crossbench senators. The tiebreakers on whether the government gets to have their gas-led recovery are in South Australia. As South Australians, we have the most impact on their vote. Being part of AYCC is empowering for so many reasons. We're the largest youth-led organisation in the country and operate alongside the Seed Indigenous Youth Climate Network, who do incredible work in leading the climate movement toward climate justice and land rights. We don't just focus on winning these campaigns, we focus on doing it through educating and empowering the other young people around us to use their voices and advocate for themselves. We meet with people in power and show them the support we have in our communities for climate justice. We are feeling the effects of climate change right now, and 2020 is really just a glimpse of our new reality. We are the generations who my mother's generation and John Hewson's generation were fighting for. To work with such an incredible, creative, motivated and organised bunch of young people and to curb all expectations laid before us is a privilege, and being a communicator for this movement is really all I want to do with my life now. So thank you very much for having me.
Sorry, I unmute. Thanks, Sam. That's great. So now we're going to go to some of the questions that you've been sending in. So if you just bear with me a minute, because I think we've heard from Sam and Holly about how important their personal experiences have been and how that has helped them to get involved in ground up. What I heard as well is that the conversations around you are really important in bringing other people into the discussions about climate change. John's reminded us that between the two age groups and across the age groups, we have 60% of the voters. So we have a good stack of political interference that we can run here. So let's see what you're saying in your questions. So the first one on my screen, it says, is carbon capture investment a legitimate technological solution to the climate crisis, or does it promote an avoidance of substantive changes to the energy sector? So who'd like to have a go at that one?
I have a go. Look, it seems to me that the original concept of carbon capture and storage, say with a coal-fired power station, was you catch the gas as it comes out of the smokestack, you liquefy it, you transport it, and you store it. Now, that's assuming you can store it. That costs about $100 US a tonne. That says you need a carbon price of at least $100 US a tonne to make that process viable. And no, that doesn't work. Capturing, though, carbon in the soil through regenerative agriculture that I mentioned does work. So you've got to ask people what they mean by carbon capture and storage, but sequestration in the soil is an obvious winner. The old idea of catching it, nobody does it, catch it effectively, and as I say, liquefy, transport and storage, it just doesn't happen, and it won't happen. And so it is a distraction, and billions of dollars have been poured into that globally over the years without any net progress, to my mind, at all.
Sam, did you want to have a go at that as well?
Yeah, I think that at this point in time, especially with you know, the gas-led recovery looming in our very near futures, it's very important to keep the pressure up for that, you know, transition to renewable energy. Carbon capture is all well and good, but we absolutely need a just transition to renewable energy if we're going to solve the climate crisis.
Okay, thanks. So somebody else has picked up the question that we're working across generations and has asked the question about, for John, do you have conversations with perhaps grandchildren or younger people? And Holly and Sam, do you have parents and grandparents? I think, Sam, you spoke about your mum, but do you have grandparents that you have these conversations? So they're interested in whether the conversations actually cross generations like we are today. John?
They do. I mean, in my case, they do. I have two girls that are now 16 and 10, and they are really pronounced climate change activists, and they both become vegetarians. You know, they both changed a whole lot of aspects of our life. We even have chooks now, you know. You know, and there was a student, they've been to a number of these student rallies, but one of them last year, we were away, my wife and I were away, and they produced their own posters. The oldest one's poster was "Denial is not a policy." And the youngest one, who was then 9, on her own says, "It's about my future." And that's the sense of the mood, I think. That is very real. I was talking to quite a significant journalist in Australia recently, and I said, "I notice you've changed your tune on climate." You know, she used to be a skeptic. And he said, "Well, you know, I've got teenage kids and I can't get in the house if I don't." So it's happening. Those conversations are happening. And maybe if we reduce the voting age to about 13 or 14, probably it'd make a huge difference. I'm not advocating that, but you can see the point that the next generation coming through, these Holly and Sam, for example, their generation is going to, it doesn't matter what old, you know, men in suits think is important, they're going to determine the outcome of those elections.
So it's interesting, isn't it, in that our poll of older people said, as you have said to your grandchildren and your children, you know, we care about the next generation. You know, we want to leave the world a better place for the next generation. And that was one of the most common statements that we got in our polling of older people.
It's irresponsible not to do that. I mean, it is the biggest economic, social, political, and indeed moral issue of our time.
Yeah. And
they should recognise the significance of that and the responsibilities to lead a government that deals with it.
Yeah, yeah. Sam, Holly, you want to have a go at that? Do you talk to grandparents, Holly?
Yeah, so it was actually when I started working on the Origin campaign. We were trying to get a bit of information about what people thought about Origin's plans. And I remember being so nervous, like sitting down with my grandparents being like, oh my God, they're so conservative. They're not going to care about this at all. But I spoke to her about it, and my grandma went on this massive rant, and she was like, I can't believe that everyone is doing. And she was actually a lot more proactive than what I gave her credit for. So it was like, yeah, I was really glad to have that conversation with her, because I realized that, yeah, my family probably weren't as bad as what I thought they were. And she was, yeah, all on board. It was great.
Yeah, fabulous. Sam, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I've radicalized my nan. She's watching right now. And yeah, in conversations, she's now a Greens voter. So,
so we've got a couple of questions from people who want to know more. So one, how do I find out how to get an electricity supplier that delivers sustainably produced electricity? I have solar panels. I'd like to know how to find out about carbon offset projects. Are young people moving away from fossil fuel dominated transport and embracing public transport? So there are lots, so there are people wanting to know things, which I think is really important, because we wanted to have this webinar as a start to try and get the conversations going, to get the information out, to get people, you know, exchanging those ideas. And so, you know, we're hoping that we'll pick up some of those thoughts as we go forward. But did anyone want to comment on those quick questions? Maybe I said them too quickly, did I? John?
Sam. I use PowerShop for my energy, because they don't do gas in South Australia, but nationwide they do renewable energy pro.
Yeah. Holly? Did I say those things too quickly? Yeah, sorry. John, did you pick up anything out of that you want to add?
I just mentioned one thing. I have a colleague who has developed a platform for giving people an opportunity to get carbon offsets directly. They can buy a share or all of a solar panel in a solar farm that exists. And the program gives them a return on that. They get all the carbon credits that generates, the offsets that generates. For example, if somebody put about $10,000 into a solar power farm, they'd generate enough carbon offsets to cover themselves for 20 years in their household. So well, my point is, I'm not advocating. I'm just saying that there are schemes now emerging that are going to give the average person an opportunity to do what they want to do. I mean, a lot have already responded. We've got the highest penetration of solar panels per capita on the rooftops in the world. And that's been because people have wanted to find ways to do it, but there are other ways coming. The power authorities have to be pressured into identifying this increasing source of power from solar and wind and other renewable sources. And it is happening. It's just happening slower than perhaps, certainly slower than somebody like me would like, but certainly it should be happening faster. There's no reason now. Solar is so much cheaper, for example, than new coal-fired power or new gas or whatever. And it has, much lower emissions, near zero emissions compared to all the alternatives. It's just basically a question, why wouldn't you do it? Why wouldn't you encourage that as a government? Why wouldn't you? And as has been pointed out, we have the potential as a nation to be a net exporter of that power.
Yeah.
The Asia Pacific region, they will take it. We could have big businesses in Northern Australia generating that power, not only for us, but for export. So, we should only be limited by the extent of our imagination on this, and the pace at which we adjust can be accelerated, I think, quite dramatically. But we haven't had that sort of planning. We had Northern Power Station in South Australia. We had Hazelwood in Victoria closed with no planning, no pathways, no community transition. That's not the way to do it. Plan the transition, get people engaged, show them how they'll be retrained, repositioned, reemployed, whatever. How they'll be compensated if there is a net cost in that. That's the planning that needs to be done, and you can make it fair. It's not directed to the disadvantage of any group. It's to the national benefit and to the individual benefit.
So there's a question now that I think goes to your comments about pathways, John. I think this is a really common question that people have. So how can we reassure Australians that the renewable energy sector provides not only environmental, but also economic opportunities? So
in the last couple of years pre-COVID, the biggest investment sector was renewable energy in Australia.
Yeah.
And one of the bigger creators of jobs in the construction phase has been renewable energy.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, as I said before, there was this mythology developed in the middle 90s that if you make any serious transition to lower emissions, you will cost jobs and growth.
Mm-hmm.
And that was an assumption. It's not a reality. And the reality is the opposite. And in fact, you can see now, and there's been a lot of evidence marshaled to demonstrate the jobs that can be created, the investment and the growth that can come. And although South Australia, for example, has had a few problems with the transition, there's no doubt that the move to renewable energy in South Australia is a bit of a case study for the rest of Australia as to what you can do. And they're very close to being able to complete that process.
Yeah.
I did a study for Joe Weatherall when he was Premier to show that he could sign a net zero emissions commitment by in the sub-Paris agreement on behalf of South Australia. And we showed that they could be 100% renewable by 100% renewable in the 2030s or 2040s. And, you know, this was, okay, a few transitional issues in terms of storage and so on, which is now being solved. But, you know, these are realistic objectives, and they are going to be pro-growth and pro-jobs.
Yeah.
Pro-new business. You know.
Okay. Holly, I've got one for you that's come in. So COVID is a dress rehearsal for climate change. I think John said that as well. Is there an opportunity right now to drive some awareness change? And are there any that you would particularly like to speak to?
So, yeah, I think, I mean, the answer to that question is yes. I think COVID has really shown us like what a difference everyone can make if everyone works together and everyone does the right thing, and how much it can have an impact on, you know, our social lives, our economy, just our general way of living. And I think that's really transferable to climate change. Like if we sort of all just continue on a business as usual approach, it's going to escalate and expand exponentially like we've seen with COVID. And I think that now people are really looking at, you know, getting back to a normal, like, you know, getting back to the normal that they knew before. And I think we're in a really pivotal moment to create the perception of a new normal, of one that is, you know, more environment centered and caring about the environment, because, you know, we've seen, you know, I mean, everyone saw, you know, the benefits of, you know, emissions reductions from planes being grounded and all those things, and, you know, wildlife in Venice, and, you know, we've seen how much of a benefit it actually makes. So I think that perceptions are changing already as a result of COVID, but it's a really good, opportunity to use the framework that it created to transfer it into climate change.
Yeah, great, thanks. And Sam, what about a new electronic car industry? It's been mentioned quite a lot in South Australia. Got any comments on that?
You know, I think it's a possibility. I don't really have many opinions on that. It's definitely needed. We've seen it come through in you know, the US. It's a very viable industry, and it absolutely has to be powered by renewable energy. Like, we need to sort out where our power is coming from, and we need that just transition to renewable energy, which you know, we've seen in the US. John Hewson was talking about Biden before. We know that Biden had quite a conservative you know, climate change policy until organizers, the Sunrise Movement, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez really rallied the groundswell for a more progressive, radical climate policy. And we just need to organise. Organise for more renewable energy. Just transition.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to give you all on the panel one last go at saying, so what do you think we should do right now? So John, do you want to start off since you've got your mic off?
I would think that we should, why not try a combined aged youth approach to government? Instead of just, you know, spreading it into the two groups, say, look, this is an issue of broad-based community concern. I mean, every poll tells you that 80+% of people want decisive government-led action on climate. And most of the major organisations in this country, whether they're miners or farmers or businesses or, you know, civil society groups and so on, have all said the same thing. And in those circumstances, it's time that we changed our position as a nation. And if the youth, who account for 30%, and the aged, who account for 31% of the votes, actually make that point definitively, somebody's going to have to listen. But this nonsense, we're going backwards. The Labor Party started another internal dispute to go backwards. The Liberal Party's still going backwards at a time where the community is screaming out for them to go forwards. I ran this argument in the Wentworth by-election. A candidate running on green issues in that seat can win, even if the margin is 17.5%. And Karen Phelps did. And they didn't learn anything from that experience. The electorate will move if the issues are put to them correctly. And be fiddling around with Adani mines and new gas generation is grossly irresponsible. So I think you've got a powerful opportunity, as Holly just said, in the context of a COVID recovery, to put a persuasive argument from both ends of the age spectrum to government. And I think coming together for that purpose would be a very sensible thing to do.
Thanks, John. Holly, what do you think?
I think for young people, something you can do right now is definitely get, like I did, involved with the AYCC. We've got a Facebook group and an Instagram page, and getting the content that we share out there so a lot of people can see, you know, what change can actually be done. But also, like I said before, like really encouraging and participating in those conversations with, you know, amongst young people or intergenerationally, or, you know, just really ramping up those conversations and making sure that it's important that people feel empowered to make change and know that there is actually something that we can do about it.
Thank you. Sam?
Yeah, I think making your voice heard in a collective setting is very important at the moment, and also getting in the room with decision makers, because we know that they have fossil fuel executives in their ear. They're having those meetings, they're providing that funding to, you know, across the political spectrum. So it's imperative that we also get in there and make our voices heard, and, you know, make them see that short-term profit just isn't worth the long-term damage. And yeah, we are currently working on chatting to Senator Sterling Griff, who is a critical crossbencher in the federal Senate, who can make, you know, make or break the gas-led recovery and lead us towards a renewable energy future. So follow our IG, AYCCSA, to figure out or to find out what we're doing on that front. But yeah, if you're an older person, not part of the youth spectrum, you know, share our content, chat to the younger people in your life, and just like really, you know, make them believe that they have so much power in deciding our futures.
Thanks very much, Sam. And thank you for people who put in questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them. This is first of a series of what we think will be a series of webinars. So we're hoping we'll pick up from your ideas from the questions and try and get to them in future webinars. So COTA SA put together, the climate change group has put together a statement on climate change. I know that feels like this is just a statement, but we thought if we put our thoughts into a statement, what it does is it helps us all to have like that elevator pitch where we're all saying the same thing, which makes it more powerful. So we'd like to officially launch our statement on climate change. And I think it's coming up on the screen. No, it's not coming up on the screen, but we're telling you where it is so that you can, what we'd like you to do is to share that statement with people, to take the pledge in a way, to send it around to at least 5 people around you. I think what we've heard today is that younger people and older people, as John has pointed out, are a really strong voting bloc, and that if we're all working in the same direction together, as Holly and Sam have said, if we join together to do that, we're going to be a really strong voting bloc, and the opportunity arises then to go to all of our MPs, our politicians, with a strong statement about what we want and where we want the change to happen. Ask for their leadership, as John said, in identifying pathways to go forward, so that we can all make sure that we're pushing in the same direction. So what we believe is that the more people we have as champions, the more influence we have for change. We've heard how important it is to use our and steer our political influence, and so you may wish to take that statement, to send it around, to put it in newsletters, to send it to friends, and then to use it to lobby and advocate with your MPs. So I want to finish by giving a huge vote of thanks to our speakers, to John Hewson, to Hollee McKinnon and to Sam James. It's been fantastic to have this time to talk together on these issues. We hope this is just the start of some serious work we will do together. So if you could watch for the dates for that on the COTA SA website and the AYCC website, we'll have contact details and webinar details. We want to work across the generations to get more information on how we can all get practically involved in climate action, and through that work towards a sustainable future environment for us all. So thank you very much for being with us today. We hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have, and please stay in touch with us. Thank you. Bye.